bucks an ounce. Inflows, of course, as well into bullion-backed ETFs topped some 100 tons in the past through August. Finally, we are, of course, watching the path of Hurricane Dorian out in the Atlantic. It is headed towards Florida, but it now seems to be that it will skirt the edge of Florida. Still, we're looking at the impact on cat bounds. That's the impact here. These other brightly coloured circles showing the impact from previous severe weather events. UBS saying Dorian could cause at least $25 billion worth of insurance losses. If it does make landfall in Florida, that could rise to $40 billion, Guy.
Wow, big numbers. Emma, thank you very much indeed. Hong Kong authorities are appealing for calm after the city witnessed one of its worst weekends of violence in the protests began in June. Yvonne Mann is in downtown Hong Kong for us. Yvonne, the city's government isn't ruling out invoking emergency measures to curb the demonstrations. What is the situation like now? It's approaching midnight. Is the city calm?
Not really, Guy. We've actually seen things pick up a bit over on the Kowloon side. And what we've been seeing here is what started at these rallies here at Tamar Park have moved over to parts of Mongkok, Prince Edward as well, where there were some confrontations with riot police there in the last couple of minutes or so. Keep in mind, Prince Edward was one of the key areas where we saw the violence over the weekend, where we saw tens of thousands of demonstrators in these running battles with police officers. At one point, that they were vandalizing ticket machines. They were setting barricades on fire. And at one point, police officers had to fire pepper spray inside the trains, which we haven't seen before. And so at this point, we're just seeing the violence get worse. The government continuing to praise the work of police, saying that they're showing a lot of restraint in the face of these attacks. They've ramped up the rhetoric as well, while appealing to calm, saying that this radical behavior is spreading like a pandemic. And as you mentioned, considering now this emergency law, which would give them more power to make arrest, seize and search property, censor publication, and even shut down the internet, Guy.
In terms of the tactics that are being employed, we have seen an escalation. You've been reporting on this throughout the night. What are people talking about in terms of what could happen next? How the authorities respond next seems to me to be absolutely crucial. The situation is going worse, not better. The authorities are further away from the protest than they have been for some weeks. Is there do the protesters have a sense of kind of anticipating a further escalation from the authorities?
It seems like they are. In fact, after what happened this weekend, they haven't backed down in any way. We saw these student groups now launching 2 weeks that they're expecting these boycotts are going to go on for, and encouraging students to now skip school. We just had the first day of school for most students here in the city, and trying to get them to sustain the momentum around the city here as summer vacation is essentially over. Beijing, of course, has always been betting on the fact that now that school has started, that potentially this is all going to start fizzling out. That's going to be a big concern among the movement here, to try to get big rallies like this. But it doesn't seem like we see any kind of resolution. Police, government still haven't changed their language or even their tactics here on trying to ease the tensions and perhaps even maybe ease some of the fears that we have in the safety of the people here. So I guess it seems like we're saying the same thing every week, Guy. It becomes an interesting issue of what could be brought up here now that both sides are still so far apart.
Yvonne, thank you very much indeed, as ever, for your fantastic reporting. Yvonne Mann joining us from Hong Kong, where it is 11:20 in the evening. Hong Kong, not the only issue China is dealing with today. Beijing playing down President Trump's latest trade war escalation after tariffs on roughly $110 billion in Chinese imports went into effect yesterday. All of this against the backdrop of slowing global growth. We're joined by Jeremy Stretch, head of G10 FX strategy at CIBC. US Treasuries just had their best month since 2008. People are flocking to duration. They're flocking to anything with a positive yield. August was a massive month. Given the trade backdrop, do you expect September to be any different?
Well, you're right that we have seen an enormous rush of capital towards yield and a dash for safety over the course of the last few weeks. Now, you can argue that, of course, the summer period and the liquidity lull may have amplified that, but if we are going to continue to see these global trade tensions escalating and we continue to see more and more focus on lower rates or easier monetary policy globally, then, of course, the path of least resistance is probably still going to be in this course of direction. But because of the scale of the move that we've seen thus far, and if you take the view that there isn't going to be an obvious escalation, because of course if we go beyond the sort of tariffs that we're starting to see now, then it will be much more difficult for the US in particular to argue that it isn't going to impact the US consumer, and that of course is going to be more important as we move both towards the festive season but also into the election race next year. If you don't take that sort of extension in terms of the crisis scenario, then maybe we're starting to look a little bit extended at these sort of levels.
Dollar's been going up, up and up, though, during this whole process.
Indeed it has, and of course that's not been unnoticed in the White House. And in a sense that's part of the narrative, and that's part of the particular questioning that we're seeing from the White House in terms of Fed policy, because of course Mr. Powell's life cycle is proven to be increasingly pressured, or his backdrop is proven to be increasingly pressured by the narrative from the White House. The debate about the currency becomes ever more extreme. Now, of course, we've seen some discussions on the periphery of the White House about discussions about intervention. I don't think that's a story that necessarily has legs at this particular juncture, but clearly in an environment where other central banks are actively continuing to focus on monetary easing, and of course the ECB is the obvious case in point, then of course the dollar index is going to continue to rise if the market perceives that the other central banks are going to be acting much more aggressively than the Fed. So I think the pressure point in the dollar is still going to be evident as we go into the fourth quarter. But the question is, are we going to see some signs of slowdown in the US? Are we going to start to see a little bit of a pickup in inflationary pressure in the US as well as a function of some of these tariffs? And that might be a catalyst which will stem some of the investor flows towards the dollar.
It's going to be interesting because Jerome Powell is speaking in Zurich on Friday, a country which has negative 75 basis points, and I just wonder whether the president will use that as an opportunity to maybe highlight.
One suspects that might be noted in the White House, because although the White House are not necessarily actively calling for negative rates at this point, we know that the pressure on Jerome Powell to act aggressively is very much in the forefront of the president's thinking, and it is going to be evident that the parallels, or the paradox, I should say, of the policy of the SNB and the Federal Reserve in terms of their rate conundrums will be evident on that particular horizon.
Jeremy, stick around. Plenty more still to come from Jeremy Stretch of CIBC. He's going to stay with us. Let's get a quick check on the markets to give you an assessment of where we are as we approach the European close. We are, and this is a huge caveat, trading on very, very, very light volume today. The Stoxx 600 up by 0.4%. US futures are flat. The pound, though, is under pressure on A, the political headlines, and B, the data that we are seeing today out of the UK. And we continue to see as well the dollar moving higher against the Chinese currency. All of those things worth paying attention to. We'll have more market coverage as we count you down to the European close in around 4... Live from London, I'm Guy Johnson. This is the European Close on Bloomberg Markets. We are 4 minutes away from the European Close. Let me show you some numbers. We are trading a little bit higher on the continent. As you can see, the DAX and the CAC are trading higher, but volumes are very low. The FTSE 100 is higher today. The reason for that is the pound is lower. They are antagonistic. One trades lower, the other one trades higher. But just in terms of some of the volumes that we're seeing, basically on the continent, the CAC, the DAX, the IBEX, the FTSE MIB are all trading circa half of the volumes that they would normally trade. The London market, which is deeper and a little broader, is trading on around 2/3 of the volume that it would normally trade on. That's the impact that the US Labour Day market is having on the European markets. Closes next. This is Bloomberg. "30 seconds to go until the end of regular trading here in Europe." Not exactly regular trading in Europe, to be honest, today. Very light volumes. As you can see, not much action when it comes to the headline numbers. A lot of grey out there in Europe, basically indicating these markets going nowhere. London's a bit of a bright spot, though, isn't it? FTSE 100 up by 1.11%. The DAX, though, on the continent, trading up by 1/10 of 1%. CAC up by 1/10 of 1% as well. In terms of what's been happening, the pound has been the biggest factor today in terms of equity market movements. The pound basically going down, poor trade data, poor manufacturing data, and also the politics of what is happening down in Westminster, basically dragging the cable rate, as you can see, down by 0.8%. It started at kind of 9:30 this morning. That's the impacts of the manufacturing data, but the politics has kind of incrementally just pushed us a little bit further down throughout the day. I've been mentioning it throughout the day, but I think it is worth making the point. I don't think you are seeing a true reaction to the headline news that we're getting on trade today out of the European markets. They are not a useful indicator. And the reason for that, again, it comes back to the volume. Let me just highlight this for you. That is normal volume there, that blue line. I hope you can just about make that out. That is where we are, and this is the DAX I'm talking about here. Basically, we're trading on circa 50% of the normal volume that you'd see going through these European markets today. And that tells you that you really can't extract much sort of signal from the noise that we're getting out of European markets. Anyway, that's the situation. We'll wait for tomorrow. We'll see what the reaction is then. In the meantime, let's get a Bloomberg First Word News update. Here's Naomi Kerbel.
Thank you, Guy. Hurricane Dorian has slowed to a crawl over the Bahamas, where it's causing colossal damage. The storm was downgraded to a Category 4, but still has winds of 113 miles an hour, and a storm surge of up to 23 feet could be deadly. The National Hurricane Center says Dorian will gradually turn to the northwest to begin a run up the U.S. East Coast. A fire on a dive boat off the coast of Southern California has caused some deaths and left 34 missing. Ventura County officials have told local news media there are fatalities, but they don't know how many. 5 crew members sleeping on the top deck of the boat were rescued. It was near Santa Cruz Island when the fire broke out. China is striking back at new U.S. tariffs. It's rolling out duties on $75 billion of U.S. imports, and those tariffs are aimed at the heart of President Trump's political support: farms and factories in the Midwest and the South. Beijing retaliated after U.S. tariffs for $110 billion on Chinese products took effect. Poland hopes for an agreement on expanding the U.S. military presence there by the end of the year. President Andrzej Duda and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence discussed the issue at a news conference in Warsaw. In June, President Trump agreed to send 1,000 more American soldiers to Poland. There are 4,500 in the country already. That's seen as a sign of pushing back against Russia. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Naomi Kerbel. This is Bloomberg. Guy.
Naomi, thank you very much indeed. Let's get back to the Brexit story. We've seen headlines crossing the Bloomberg in the past few hours indicating that UK lawmakers are planning to try and pass legislation forcing Prime Minister Boris Johnson to delay Brexit for 3 months to January the 31st. This, unless he can get a new agreement with the EU by mid-October. Bloomberg has learned that the UK Prime Minister will treat the vote as a vote of no confidence, though, which could pave the way for him calling a general election. However, a spokesman for Boris Johnson said this morning that the PM doesn't want an election. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. via Skype is Jacob Fuggergaard, the Peterson Institute for International Economics Senior Fellow. Still with us here on set in London, Jeremy Stretch, CIBC. Jacob, it is early there, but the situation over here in London seems to be fairly fluid. What is your assessment of what is going to happen next? Boris Johnson looks like he is going to face an effective vote of no confidence tomorrow.